Hi, my name is Autif Kamal. This is another episode of Be Logical. This one is about banks in Cyprus that were going bankrupt. And it happened about a week prior to this recording. The reason why I'm going over this is to compare the Cypriot government responses to these banks in Cyprus that were going bankrupt as compared to the American responses to US banks going bankrupt. Now first, Cyprus is an island that is below Turkey and above Egypt. Just to give you an idea of where it is. And some US banks were going bankrupt there, and to alleviate their burden of bankruptcy, they proposed to seize 6.75% or 9.9% of their depositor funds based on whether they made 20,000 to 100,000 or over 100,000. So over 100,000, they would seize 9.9% of their depositors' funds. If their depositors had 20 to 100,000, they would seize 6.75% of their funds. Now, prior to the Cypriot government putting this up to a vote, the ATMs weren't working, the banks were closed until Thursday, money couldn't be transferred to other countries. And it was interesting that banks were closed until a day after the government would put this idea up to a vote. And the reason why they had prevented all this, that is, depositors from taking out their money, is because if depositors had found out that they had money in a bank that was going bankrupt, then everyone would rush over to their bank to take out their money, and the Cypriot banks might not have had the physical cash to give to all their depositors. So that's why they did that. Now, when this was put up to a vote, there was absolutely no government support from the Cypriot government to take the depositors' funds to help the Cypriot banks alleviate their bankruptcy. There are only 56 members of parliament in the Cypriot government, and like 36 voted against and 19 just abstained from voting. Now, if this proposal had been passed, then it would have basically covered 5.8 billion euros of the 17 billion euros that those banks had to pay. Now compare that response of like absolutely zero support to the American response for when the US gave a bailout to tons of financial firms and US banks. In September of 2008, they gave out $700 billion in emergency bailout money, as proposed by Henry Paulson and Ben Bernanke. And basically, by giving out that money, the government purchased failed assets. And there's a graphic here to break down who got what amount of the bailout, where AIG and automakers and financial firms had the greatest share of the bailout. And if you go to the link for this graphic, you'll see a list of all the financial firms and the US banks that were given some of this bailout money. And you also see that a minority of those financial firms and banks at the time that this article was published had paid back their bailout money. And now think about this. The bailout came from the government, and the taxpayers fund the government, so that the bailout came from taxpayers. So it's interesting that the government supported giving funds to US banks. And to be fair, the bankruptcy that had occurred in Cyprus might be different than the bankruptcy that had occurred in the US. The US one might have had more significant consequences. I'm not for sure on that, but that's a possibility. Now, U.S. banks have definitely at least paid 211 billion out of 204.5 billion that was given to them through a repayment program called TARP. However, at the same time, 48% of those banks that had paid back the government used money from federal programs to pay them back. But where does money from federal programs come from? Well, taxpayers fund federal programs. Some banks use federal programs to repay the government, so those banks use taxpayer money to repay the government, which means they're not really using their own money to repay the government. They're using government money to repay the government. So they didn't really pay the government. Now, I find that interesting just because I guess the U.S. government didn't put any obstructions or prevent that from happening. So it just shows you the level of leniency and leeway that the U.S. government gave to the banks in terms of paying back the government. In my view, it seems kind of careless. But yeah, anyway, the general takeaway is that there seems to be a lot more support for the banks in the U.S. than in Cyprus, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Anyway, thank you for watching or listening to this episode of Be Logical.